You ready, Sherry?
Oh, wait a minute, yeah, wait a minute, I wasn't ready, actually.
Okay.
I'm ready now.
Okay. Testing, 1, 2, 3, sound check for the court reporter. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Sound check for the court reporter. Good?
Yeah, keep going.
Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check for the court reporter. Oh, keep going up.
All right,
Sound check for the court reporter.
okay,
Can you hear okay?
yeah,
You sure?
yeah.
Okay.
I
I'm just
have
going to keep
my-
this because I think I'm going to.
I did have my headphone volume 50%, but I was trying to get up to like a high green. You don't have any,
It is, and I'll tell you why. Whenever I work with somebody who has a different machine, we have such a disparity in the
but it
machine.
doesn't matter. Why don't you pull it out and I'll go back down?
Okay, all right.
I mean, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Go down a bit before I start.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Okay, go
or
ahead.
else you blow your ears out.
Okay.
You ready? Sound check for the court reporter. 1, 2, 3. Sound check.
Yeah, because I'm still low and it's still.
Sound check.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah.
I did.
I have,
Yeah, I drank all my water.
I'm almost through. I'm trying to conserve.
I had to go to the bathroom. I live in the desert. I constantly drink water.
It's good. It's important.
I can't believe you moved to Maine.
I know. I'm gonna come out. Don't worry. I'm gonna come out and visit
out.
you this
Yeah,
winter.
come visit. Amazing golf, great, tons of resorts.
My wife said, she's like, I know that in the dead of winter, you're just gonna be like, yeah, I've got
have
to
to
go
go to Scottsdale."
Arizona, Texas, Florida, California.
testing, testing, test. Thank you.
The Committee on Homeland Security's Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony regarding how to maximize the value of cyber threat information sharing. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The severity of the threats we face in cyberspace can't be overstated. Seemingly every week there's a new headline about a new breach, a new hack, or a new trove of sensitive information that's been compromised. Or there's a new report highlighting the vulnerabilities of our government, the private sector, and the American people facing from malicious actors. Those on the operational front of cybersecurity know the threat landscape is evolving at every second. In cyberspace, it's nearly impossible to concisely declare who the threat actor is, what they're going to do next, and what the cascading effects may be. The industry method is to prioritize, assess the risks that networks face, and prioritize actions to address those risks, and then keep moving down the list. We in the government must learn from the private sector, assess risks, prioritize mitigation, and keep moving. As I've said before, whether we rise up to the challenges in cyberspace will play a large part in determining whether America remains the world's superpower. To effectively address these threats, I couldn't agree more with the consensus opinion that the private sector and the government need to collaborate. I see a big part of our collective responsibility being to ensure that this collaboration results in not just rhetoric, but in a tangible improvement in our country's cybersecurity posture. What we're here today to examine is perhaps one of the most readily visible and promising forms of this collaboration, the sharing of cyber threat indicators between the private sector and the federal government. In an ecosystem where there is no silver bullet, it's incumbent upon us to conduct rigorous oversight of our information sharing programs to help increase the participation in and volume of cyber threat information shared with the private sector. The private sector is the front line for action in cyberspace. In supplying the private sector with an increasing amount of actionable information, we enable our partners to tilt the scales away from our cyber adversaries. As a committee, we are continually seeking to learn about possible ways that the department can help to increase the resilience of private sector networks and fine-tune their own efforts for the response, analysis, mitigation of cyber threats. According to DHS, the automated indicator sharing program has shared over 1.3 million unique indicators, more than 264,000 shared in September alone, and there are currently 135 non-federal entities participating in AIS, 22 of which are sector-specific organizations comprised of groups of companies. DHS estimates the actual reach of AIS indicators to be greater than 10,000 organizations. As encouraging as it is to see these programs take shape and fill the very important role of convening partners and bridging information sharing from the government to the private sector, we can do better. A recent report from the DHS Office of Inspector General reinforces this notion that there's more work to be done. Today, I look forward to hearing insights and recommendations from our witnesses that we can take back to DHS to continue to strengthen its work sharing cyber threat information. We are tasked with overseeing the crucial DHS programs, knowing that improvements are always possible. Each of you has unique perspective that will provide invaluable knowledge that we can build on as DHS continues to refine its programs. We will need creative and possibly significant changes to the way that we do things if we expect to gain ground in this fight. In a space this transformative and this disruptive, the best option is continued partnership. As disparate as the opinion of the private sector and the government can be on many issues, when it comes to security, we are all looking for able, willing, and effective partners. The information technology landscape is central to every sector of the economy and every consumer and individual who depend on these systems. The automation of cyber threat information and the incorporation of classified and unclassified information are areas the government can work on in order to increase the effectiveness of the information being provided to the private sector. It is for this reason that we have gathered in this panel of experts to talk about or talk to the efficacy of cyber threat information sharing and improvements that can be made with it. We look forward to hearing from the witnesses, their perspectives and understanding of the current state of cyber threat information sharing and their vision and their recommendations for a safer future. Again, thanks to our witnesses for your willingness to share your expertise with us today. I now recognize the ranking member for any, my colleague and friend from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for any opening statement that he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to our witnesses, and I want to begin by thanking Chairman Radcliffe for holding today's hearing on cyber threat information sharing and his leadership on this issue more broadly. 2 years ago, Congress passed the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 to remove barriers to fuller and faster cybersecurity threat indicator sharing, both between government and the private sector and among private entities. This legislation was a result of years of negotiation between experts from industry, academia, private advocates, and security professionals. At the time, there was broad consensus that we were not sharing, analyzing, and integrating data around cyber threats as well as we could be. To answer this gap in our cybersecurity posture, representatives from both sides of the aisle came together as partners to deliver legislation that removed the legal hurdles that prevented the free flow of threat indicators and to provide liability protections to encourage sharing. Today, those barriers are gone. There are ironclad authorizations for companies to share indicators within industry and back and forth with the Federal Government. There are liability protections to ensure that these actions do not inadvertently put companies at risk. There are even protections on the data themselves to ensure that they are not used for any regulatory action by the government. The Cybersecurity Act of 2015 also created a channel for the government to better disseminate information that would otherwise be classified. By placing these signals amongst the contributions from all participants, DHS can basically disguise the original sources. During the period of October 2015 to April 2017, the Department shared some 2,900 formally classified cyber threat indicators through the Automated Sharing Indicator Program, or AIS. However, despite these advancements, we have a long way to go in operationalizing the law and policy that has been developed. AIS is a good example, it's a great example, I should say. Barely more than 100 companies right now have elected to join the program and contribute to the common threat picture, a level of participation that is simply, quite frankly, unacceptable. Part of this is on the Department, as we have heard numerous times before this committee, that the indicators shared by the government are often late and lack important context. But part of this also falls on industry. After all, with only roughly 100 private sector participants, it seems many people knocking the data being shared by AIS haven't applied much effort to analyzing the data. 2,200 formally classified threat indicators, I believe, certainly count for something. So that's why I'm grateful to Chairman Radcliffe and Ranking Member Richmond for continuing to study this issue. We need to know what is and isn't working with the law and with the Department's efforts. We also need to know what activities are being enabled that weren't happening before passage of the law and the ironclad authorizations that I mentioned. I've said many times that information sharing is not a silver bullet. In fact, there is no such thing in cybersecurity. But I do believe in its promise to help better our cybersecurity posture, and we in Congress owe it to the American people to ensure that we are meeting that potential. So I'll be interested in hearing from the witnesses what we in Congress can do to improve the Department's efforts and to improve uptake among private sector participants. Personally, I think that we may need some more assistance from the Department in building a robust ecosystem around the feed rather than just relying on it being out there. And I hope the Department looks to the financial sector's expertise with Sultra Edge for guidance. But I also hope that the private sector, innovative as it is, applies some of the creativity to the data coming out of DHS rather than waiting. Finally, there are two related issues that I want to mention briefly. First, I believe that it will be extremely difficult for the Department to make any lasting changes in its policies without permanent political leadership in place, and I hope the Administration moves swiftly to fill critical vacancies at the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Cybersecurity is a national priority, and the personnel decisions made by the White House need to reflect that. Second, a brief comment on the new Vulnerabilities Equity Process, or the VEP charter that's released today. Now, I'm grateful that the document continues the presumption of disclosure and ensures a broad array of government stakeholders, including DHS, have a seat at the table when discussing vulnerabilities. I'm also pleased by the increased level of transparency indicated by the publication of the charter in unclassified form and by the annual reports, including to Congress, that it requires. We owe the selfless Americans who serve their nation as members of the intelligence community an enormous debt of gratitude, a debt that is far too infrequently acknowledged. As members of Congress, we also owe them rigorous oversight to ensure that the tools they develop remain secure. I believe that the VEP is an appropriate process for selecting the very few vulnerabilities where disclosure will be delayed. However, that process falls apart if the exploits cannot be kept in government hands, and Congress must do more to ensure those safeguards are in place. So with that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I certainly look forward to discussing ways to improve our collective cybersecurity with all of them. And before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I have a letter that I'd like to submit for the record from the Electronic Privacy Information Center on some of these topics as well.
Without objection, will be admitted into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman.
I yield back.
Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are very pleased to have a very distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. Mr. Robert Kanaki is the Whitney Shepherdson Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and is testifying today on behalf of the Global Resilience Institute. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Kanaki. Ms. Ann Barron DiCamillo is the Vice President of Cyber Intel and Incident Response at American Express. We're glad to have you with us today as well. Ms. Patricia Cagliostro is the Federal Solutions Architect Manager at Anomaly. Thanks for agreeing to testify today. And finally, Mr. Robert Mayer is the Senior Vice President for Cybersecurity at the U.S. Telecom Association. Mr. Mayer, welcome to you as well. I'd now ask the witnesses to stand and raise your right hand so I can swear you in to testify. Do each of you swear or affirm that the testimony which you'll give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kanaki for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Radcliffe. Thank you, Ranking Member Donovan, Langevin, and distinguished members of the committee. I want to start out by saying that I think we've made tremendous progress on this issue over the last 5 years in particular. I would recognize the Cyber Information Sharing Act of 2015 as really having cleared the underbrush on cybersecurity information sharing. There really should no longer be any reason why a company says they cannot legally share information. So I think we've done that. I'm proud to have supported that work when I was working in the Obama administration and had always a very good relationship with your committee and your staff members. Now I think the question is not how do we get rid of disincentives, but how do we incentivize sharing, and how do we put in place the mechanisms we need to make information sharing possible? I'd focus on two areas. The first is I think that we've already done almost everything we can to declassify information for information sharing. I think classified information exists for a reason. It needs to be protected. Yet at the same time, Many private sector companies that operate critical infrastructure need that information. So the only way that we can solve that problem is if we extend classified connectivity for information sharing to critical infrastructure companies. That would, I think, be a very significant move that also has strong precedent. The Department of Defense has operated something called the Defense Industrial Base Network now since 2008. They've shown that it is possible to share classified information with private companies for their own defense. I think what we need to do on this topic is to create something that I'll call CINet, or Critical Information Network, with a classified component, and share that with, I would say, the Section 9 companies under Executive Order 13636 to start. Those companies, I think, have been recognized as facing a severe threat from our nation's adversaries, and they need to be brought into that classified network. So I think we could do that under existing authorities that Congress has granted to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and that the President has already extended to the Secretary. I think that is entirely possible and achievable. I'd recommend that we proceed with a pilot effort in that regard. I think it could be done for a limited amount of money and under existing authorities. The second topic that I'll touch on just briefly is the need for what people call a NTSB for cybersecurity, a National Transportation Safety Board for cybersecurity. This is the idea that when a plane crashes, investigators show up and they immediately try and find, why did a plane go down? Why did a train derail? In cybersecurity, we need that. When an incident happens, what everybody wants to know is, why did it happen and what can they do to protect themselves? Were they affected by the same incident? Were they targeted by the same adversaries? We have no mechanism to do that now other than leaks and media reports and rumor, innuendo, and surmise. From my perspective, the appropriate way to do this is not to take this NTSB analogy too far. That's a government mandate, that's a regulated program. Rather, what I'd like to see is a voluntary effort that is possibly advocated for or created by DHS, but led with the private sector, that I think is backed by insurance, where you would get the equivalent of an insurance discount if you agree to have investigators come in, figure out what went wrong, and share that information, possibly anonymously, with the rest of the sector. I think if we had that kind of setup and that pre-commitment to engaging in this way, we'd be able to get the most valuable information out of a company that's been targeted by these adversaries. If you were able to do that, I think you would address one of the hardest problems in information sharing, which is the fact that if you have been targeted, sharing information about that doesn't help you. It helps everybody else. It's a tragedy of the commons. I think a program like that would overcome those hurdles. So I'll stop there. Thank you for the invitation today.
Thank you, Mr. Kanaki. Chair now recognizes Ms. Barron DiCamillo, did I say that right?
Yes, you did, sir.
For her opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Langevin, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Ann Barron DiCamillo, and I am Vice President of Cyber Intelligence and Incident Response at American Express. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I really look forward to the discussion. My role at American Express, I'm responsible for managing cyber security operations and directing cyber threat intelligence globally for the company. Prior to my role at American Express, I was Director of U.S. CERT at Homeland Security. My responsibilities there included leading cybersecurity incident response activities, as well as sharing relevant data from those events with both public and private sector companies on cyber threat information sharing initiatives. While at DHS, I engaged in efforts to mature public-private cyber threat intelligence information sharing programs like those encouraged by CISA. This legislation really helped address many of the concerns that I experienced while I was there around critical infrastructure sector partners, including American Express, and engaging in cyber threat information sharing with the government. It created ability for DHS to establish machine speed sharing while protecting enterprises from associated liability concerns. One program worth discussing today, which was already mentioned by the chairman, is AIS. AIS has had limited adoption to date and early challenges in demonstrating its full potential, as was mentioned by the ranking member. While AIS may be a good program for new entrants into cyber information sharing community, it would be more effective for more mature organizations in the broader critical infrastructure community if it offered three key things, and two of them were also mentioned by the ranking member: timelier indicator sharing, richer context around indicator information, and continual improvements to the program to ensure quality information, quality over quantity. The timeliness of cyber threat information sharing has been negatively impacted, I believe, by the government's overclassification of threat data, which is really minimizing the value that AIS can provide to the critical infrastructure community. The agency that is originating this information is sharing the information with DHS, and they're in charge of the classification or declassification of that information. When DHS has to go back and get the originating source to go through the process of declassifying it, it results in delays. And that information, many times, the threats associated with that can become obsolete because of the shifting nature of attacks within the internet. Alternatively, if the information is scrubbed, a lot of to remove the classified status, the resulting information is often so cleansed or minimized that much of the relevant context that's needed to properly action it in my organization is removed. So some proponents have suggested the timeliness issue could be resolved by increasing the number of cleared individuals in critical infrastructure. However, increased access to classified information for these individuals provides little actionable data that we can take back into our unclassified networks for implementation. Any shared data that is still classified at that level can't be actioned on an unclassified fabric. To speed up the timeliness of information sharing, we encourage our partners in law enforcement and the intelligence community to work to tier-line more of their reporting, so any actionable information, IOCs, hashes, and other things, can be shared expeditiously with critical industry. If the information is found in open source, the government should act quickly to declassify the entire report as rapidly as possible. Also, the entity's review process continues to be a stumbling block towards timely, broader, and more actionable information sharing from the government to private industry. I fully understand the intelligence community must consider both public benefit and operational risk when disclosing confidential information about a threat. However, in light of the public sector's caution when it comes to sharing information about cyber incidents, private industry is instead turning to cybersecurity firms for timelier and more contextually complete information. At American Express, we rely primarily on FSISAC and other sources, both external as well as communities of interest for a lot of our threat data. We engage in outbound sharing primarily with FSISAC and other financial institution partners through auto-sharing of IOCs and other free-form communication. Much of the threat information sharing is still being primarily shared via email, as it allows for communication with important context, which includes things of who saw it, what was seen, when was it seen, where, which part of the network, as well as how it was mitigated or contained. This relevant information a lot of times can't be shared in some of these machine-to-machine systems. Today, the AIS program does not offer this type of valuable context for the indicators that are being shared. Just as the context is important for security analysts, the lack of the context prevents users of the information from confirming that these indicators have been properly vetted, as well as received from trustworthy sources. Additionally, private sector organizations have shared feedback with DHS that they would like to see a higher volume of contextually rich data versus just a larger volume of less insightful information. One way DHS can address some of these issues is through the adoption of technology that automates the ability to apply confidence levels by source to the indicator sharing process. DHS should also consider working more closely with information recipients to learn what kinds of data and context is going to be most useful and pertinent to private industry for our own networks. Since CISA's passage, public-private information sharing has come a long way, and many positive advancements have occurred. We strongly believe that a timelier, more contextual, higher quality information sharing program is the next step in the evolution of cyber threat information for DHS. I want to thank you for inviting me to be here today and to discuss this very important issue, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Barron DiCamillo. I would now like to recognize Ms. Cagliostro. Am I saying that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Langevin, and distinguished members. I'm honored to appear before the committee today to discuss how we can improve the partnership between public and private sector to strengthen our nation's security with cyber threat information sharing. I work for a leader in the cyber threat intelligence space called Anomaly. We were the first company to automatically share intelligence back to AIS. We also integrate AIS with our technology and provide access to our customer base. Our deep integration with AIS and experience with facilitating sharing with ISACs and ISOWs provides unique insights into the critical factors for successful sharing programs and opportunities for improvement in the AIS program. In 2017, the Ponemon Institute commissioned a report that represented over 1,000 organizations from North America and the UK. This report provides critical insights about the threat intelligence industry that impact the adoption and participation in AIS. One of the biggest challenges identified by 70% of respondents was the volume of data available. To put this in perspective, there are hundreds of millions of indicators from hundreds of sources in the Anomaly platform, and we've continued to see the volume of threat data grow exponentially since our inception. AIS is one of many sources that organizations have access to. The biggest value of threat intelligence is the ability to integrate with an organization's security controls to detect and prevent malicious activity on the network. Think of threat intelligence like the no-fly list that airlines use to prevent threats from flying. If the data wasn't integrated with airline systems, the value of the list would be diminished because it couldn't prevent high-risk passengers from flying. Threat intelligence is the cyber no-fly list, and when organizations integrate with their security controls, they can actively detect and prevent threats on the network. Once an organization can consume and integrate threat intelligence, they've reached a maturity level where they're ready to actually share intelligence. 62% of organizations reported that they share intelligence today. About 50% of those said they share with trusted security vendors, while only 30% actually share with the government. When we think about maximizing the value of information sharing in the context of AIS, we need to keep in mind the state of threat intelligence. Organizations in both the public and private sector need tools to manage and integrate the overwhelming amount of threat intelligence before they're ready to share. When they are ready to share, trust and ease of use are critical for success. DHS should be commended for meeting the aggressive timelines outlined in the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, but with any large program, there are always opportunities to improve. The primary goal should be to expand AIS participations to as many organizations as possible, because more participants will ultimately impact the quality and improve the quality of the data shared. DHS can reduce the level of effort for organizations to participate in AIS by increasing the ways that people can access it and integrating it with analyst workflows. When an organization wants to connect to AIS, it can take weeks between legal reviews, between deploying technology for them to actually get connected. DHS should continue to work with third parties who can redistribute AIS through their sharing platform like ISACs and ISOWs, and security vendors like Anomaly, so organizations don't have to add additional technology in order to participate. Analysts collect and produce cyber intelligence as part of their daily workflow. In the Anomaly platform, analysts simply check a box to automatically share with their community. And they're more likely to share because it's easy. It doesn't add additional work for them. It's something they would have to do anyway as part of their regular workflow. The AIS program will benefit by integrating with security technologies like Anomaly to make it easier for organizations to share back. So again, it's part of that daily workflow. Cybersecurity isn't a marathon or a sprint. There is no finish line in sight. We face a dynamic adversary, and we need to use every advantage that we have. The attack surface is too large, and resources are stretched too thin for organizations to defend alone. Information sharing acts as a force multiplier and can help level the playing field. In the most recent election, the Colorado State ISAC partnered with Anomaly to share intelligence in real time with various federal, state, and local organizations to maximize their ability to defend the integrity of our elections. Real-world success stories of the power of information sharing, supported by public and private sector partnerships, will continue to drive adoption and participation in programs like AIS. Thank you guys for inviting me today.
Thank you, Ms. Cagliostro. Mr. Mayor, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Is that it? I apologize. Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Langevin, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today for this important hearing. My name is Robert Mayer, and I serve as Senior Vice President, Cybersecurity at U.S. Telecom. I also serve as Chair of the Communications Sector Coordinating Council, which represents the broadcast, cable, satellite, wireless, and wireline segments of the communications industry. The CSCC is one of 16 critical infrastructure sectors operating through the Department of Homeland Security's Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council. Today, the wide variety and large volume of cyber threat information sources, along with the growing number of information sharing venues, presents both opportunities and challenges in creating real value to information sharing. Since the passage of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, much has been done to reduce obstacles to sharing and to facilitate enabling mechanisms and venues. The communication sector works on multiple fronts to share cyber threat information, and in my written testimony, I note that for more than 35 years, dating back to the Cold War era, the United States government has worked in operational partnership with the communication sector to better assure the reliability, availability, and resiliency of our networks. The relationship between the communication sector and the DHS National Coordinating Center for Communication stands alone among critical infrastructure information sharing partnerships in both depth and length of partnership. Jointly, the relationship between the Communication Sector Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the COMISAC, with over 65 participating private sector companies, and the NCC is one that many sectors are attempting to replicate. 5 of the largest domestic network service providers have representatives embedded within the NCC, and through the NCC work on the floor of the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center, or NCIC as it is known. Many more formal and informal structured and unstructured venues are described in the March 2017 FCC CISRIC report referenced in my testimony. As a practical matter, companies will participate in information sharing activities to the extent that they perceive the benefits outweigh or at least match the costs. Any information sharing venue and mechanism that does not provide contextualized, timely, accurate, and actionable information that improves the provider's security posture will not meet the test. The CISRIC report found that a critical organizational challenge facing our sector is the wide variety of private, public to private, and international activities devoted to cyber information sharing. Many organizations, especially smaller service providers, are unfamiliar with the breadth and depth of information sharing entities or lack the resources to commit to these enterprises. These organizations are in most cases unable to devote scarce resources to time-consuming efforts to filter numerous sources of threat intelligence, validate what is applicable, and then set implementation priorities. While there are no easy solutions for these companies, trade associations like U.S. Telecom and the 13 other sector trade associations that are also members of the CSCC provide a critical link to information resources that can enhance their security posture. For many of the larger service providers, the distribution of classified information from the federal government is an essential element of their overall risk management capabilities, and this can impact the quality of information shared between private parties and within organizations. We continue to request classified information when available, and we also ask that those pieces be downgraded as much as possible so that dissemination to the practitioners in the field can take place quickly. With respect to the DHS AIS portal, there is still important work that needs to be done to increase the value proposition for companies within our sector. Most of the concerns with AIS relate to the quality and usability of the information for the particular needs of an ISP and its enterprise. While the information distributed via AIS may be helpful to certain entities, the value proposition remains elusive for companies with more mature, sophisticated cybersecurity programs. To make cyber threat information sharing more viable and valuable, we encourage the government to look across various information sharing programs and analyze whether they are functioning as intended, meeting the needs of their target audiences, and identify gaps that need to be filled. Doing this will ultimately result in higher quality, contextualized, and more timely information being shared. The good news is that DHS is aware of the current limitations and is committed publicly to a multi-year effort to enhance the automated machine-to-machine sharing capabilities. DHS is to be applauded for its ongoing and accelerating outreach efforts to engage industry and to increase the value of their information sharing programs. We remain committed to bringing all available industry resources to bear in this vital area, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks again to all of our witnesses for your testimony today. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Ms. Baron DiCamillo, I want to start with you because you've got sort of unique experience, extensive experience with U.S. CERT at DHS, and now in the private sector at American Express. You have the opportunity to be part of what I think is the gold standard organization with respect to information sharing on the private side, the FSISAC. We can talk about legislation all day, but one thing that we can't legislate is confidence. So from your perspective, what are the 1 or 2 or 3 things that you would recommend that DHS do or do better for perhaps to build confidence in the private sector in both the validity and the credibility of cyber threat information that's being shared.
So getting back to some of the comments I made in my opening remarks, I think DHS, a lot of times they're not the original source associated with information that they're sharing. So creating those closer partnerships with the community in which they're receiving that information from, some of it comes from vendors and some of it comes from other government partners. In doing that, they need to ensure that the message is being carried, that methods and sourcing of the source of attribution, those aren't important actions for the community to implement within their network. Really tying or breaking apart those two things is a focus there. Being that continuing to communicate with their government partners on the importance of that, so that they can create those trusted relationships with private industry. I think from my perspective, the confidence is going to come based on the value of the indicators that they share. When those indicators are proved to be unique and different from what we receive from other sources, that increases the confidence that they will get from the larger private industry community.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Mr. Kanaki, before I came to Congress, my colleague, Mr. Langevin, worked on prior iterations of a bill we were able to successfully get across the finish line in December of 2015, the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. From your perspective, has the passage of that legislation affected the flow of cyber threat information? Have you seen it change? Has the threat landscape that companies and the government face, has that changed or been affected by our legislation?
Mr. Chairman, in my view, what's happened is that we've taken away the excuses for not sharing information, but the reality is many companies still want to find an excuse not to share. And so you can no longer say, oh, we're worried about antitrust issues, we're worried the FTC is going to come after us, DOJ is going to come after us. The reality is that for those companies that had those fears before the legislation didn't remove that as a barrier in their minds. And so I do think there's a small element of needing to educate general counsels at large corporations on this issue. I spend a lot of time working with leaders in the community, encouraging them to push back when they are told by their lawyers that they cannot share. But in my view, the real issue isn't the barriers to information sharing, it's the incentives for information sharing. You really need to find ways, we need to find ways as a community to encourage companies to want to share, right? They want to receive indicators all day long, but taking the act of extracting an indicator from their network and pushing it out to DHS is sometimes not worth the effort in their minds. It does nothing to protect them. That, I think, is the main reason we haven't seen a flourishing of information sharing.
So do you have any suggestions for how we further encourage that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic one, I think, would be to encourage it ahead of time, before an incident happens. And so this is where I look to insurance as a possible incentive, right? If government were to provide a backstop to cyber insurance, that in exchange for lower premiums, you obligated your company to participate in this kind of information sharing. That, I think, is the kind of incentive that we need now to encourage information sharing. If you said we have to do this because we're getting a lower rate, sort of like Progressive on your car insurance, right? Under that model, I think we could incentivize more information sharing.
Thanks very much. Ms. Cagliostro, very quickly, last week in a report from the Office of Inspector General on DHS's implementation of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, it was recommended that in order to achieve their mission, DHS should obtain, quote, the tools and technologies needed to provide a cross-domain solution for sharing and processing cyber threat information between the classified and unclassified repositories. As DHS evaluates potential solutions for this, what are your thoughts about the criteria for success for what those tools can be?
Sure. So when you talk about cyber intelligence, it's a little bit different than traditional human intelligence. in order to go and get access to human intelligence, you have to put resources in country, language. There's a tremendous time and effort, resource commitment there. For cyber threat intelligence, it's a little bit different because there's essentially I can deploy technologies and start collecting cyber intelligence without, and there's a very low barrier to entry. That's why I think for when you're thinking about cross-domain and bringing intelligence both up and down in both directions, it's important to know at both levels where intelligence is located. So on the classified side, for example, if it's already out there in the public domain, then why is it still classified? Why is that indicator still classified? The association to an actor, how we discovered it, that might be sensitive, but the indicator itself shouldn't be. So I think when you're thinking about tools and technologies, one of the big first steps should be aggregating the publicly available information so that way we can more effectively and more quickly declassify tools. And then I think the second piece becomes it needs to be a machine-to-machine process. My background's in Department of Defense. There's a number of ways to handle cross-domain. Some of it is very manual, some of it is automatic. I think it needs to be something that is a machine process. It shouldn't be someone once a day logging in to download files and copy them over.
Terrific. Very much appreciate the responses. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony today and the work you're doing on this topic. If I could, I'd start with Ms. Barron DiCamillo, and thank you again for your work at U.S. CERT, and again, for your testimony here and for, again, your previous government service. So it's clear that you greatly contributed to advancing the cybersecurity of a nation, and that you appreciate the value of information sharing. However, I would just mention that in your testimony, you state that American Express has not participated in the AIS program due to limited adoption and early challenges in demonstrating its full potential value, and that you engage in outbound sharing primarily with the FSISAC and other financial institution partners. So while I recognize that we can do more as a government to increase the quality of the data that we share, the value of information sharing itself is predicated on all parties actively participating. I mean, we need major corporations like American Express to be involved. So what is your plan for joining this program and contributing the insights that you gain on a daily basis in defending your networks?
So through FSISAC, we actually participate in the AIS program. We're not a direct participant, but we share information through FSISAC, so we are outbound sharing that information, which is also shared back from FSISAC into the AIS community, and then AIS shares it through FSISAC back to financial institutions like us. So we do benefit from it through that relationship we have with FSISAC. The reason why we haven't joined specifically is associated with the CRADA agreement that you must sign when you join these programs at Homeland Security. And in doing so, it precludes us from bringing on any additional cleared individuals within American Express. Because you have to go through a private industry, or you have to go through the DoD private industry clearance process. And when you have a CRADA agreement with DHS, you're forced through the facility clearance process versus the DoD clearance process for individuals. And so we are not interested in creating the infrastructure through the facility clearance process, and that's primarily the reason why we don't have the direct CRADA agreement with Homeland Security for CISP or AIS.
So what would you, is that something that a policy change between the company and DHS that needs to change?
It's probably a policy change between Homeland Security and DoD.
Okay, well, that's something that we can look at. Yeah. Thank you.
And I'm not the only financial institution that has that perspective. It wouldn't preclude any other critical infrastructure participant from engaging those programs when they sign the CRADA, or engage in getting additional cleared individuals through the clearance process when they sign that CRADA.
Okay, thank you very much for that insight. So I want to I thank the chairman for the question that he asked, the second question on what's changed, and he asked Mr. Kanaki. So I'd like to give the opportunity to Ms. Barron DiCamillo and Mr. Mayor on the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, again, made substantial changes to the legal authorities regarding cyber threat indicator sharing. So what are your organizations or for you and Mr. Mayor, are your member companies doing differently today thanks to those authorities and liability protections? And I guess as a follow-up, I could say, were any of those actions impermissible before the law, and what changed the calculus in your organization?
Thank you, Congressman. I do think that the act had some significant benefits. I mean, if nothing else, it created awareness on the part of our member companies that information sharing was something that was available, and it took care of some of the liability concerns we had about sharing threat indicators. I would put it in the category of saying that the act was necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient to incentivize all companies to participate. I think for our members who are more mature, who have the resources around cybersecurity, for them, a lot of the information they get from private sources, as well as their ability to track global network flows and do their own analysis around anomalies and things like that. It's faster, it's contextualized. It limits the incentive to participate in some of the information sharing venues that currently exist. Having said that, I would say that there's no shortage of information sharing activities that are underway in our sector. We have identified informal, formal, structured, and unstructured venues where information is currently taking place. It's a very active community.
Yeah, but I was just looking at what's changed, what's more specific things have changed since the act was passed.
Well, I think people have become more aware of the need to share information, and there's a greater willingness to do that. I think what I see is that the information sharing venues that exist are more robust today. Our association, for example, has recently created an information sharing mechanism for small and mid-sized businesses. What we've heard from them is they don't have the resources to participate in all of the information sharing venues. They appreciate a central association helping them in terms of setting priorities and where to look for information. But we have to understand that each company is going to make their own determination about the value of participating in information sharing. There's no one-size-fits-all here. So the answer to your question is directionally, we've made progress in information sharing. I don't know how to tell you that it's correlated directly to the Information Sharing Act.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. DiCamillo,
Concur with the comments from Mr. Mayor. I think we've seen increased visibility associated with information sharing organizations. There's been an increased participation beyond just the ISACs, so all different types of communities being able to engage in this, and those communities then engaging back with the government. So the increased visibility across industry from the passage of CISA, and I think the aspect of liability protection has also encouraged many to engage in ISALs, ISACs, and others, which is that bridge towards information sharing with the government.
okay. Thank you very much. Go back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I preface this with all of our cyber hearings by, you talk to a guy whose VCR still blinks 12. Okay, so you have to speak to me in layman's terms. I guess the chairman's goal here is to find out incentives for information sharing. I guess the first thing you have to look at is, like, what's the disincentives? So maybe all of you could just explain to me what the disincentives are. As a layperson, I would think that maybe you wouldn't want your competitors to know of your vulnerabilities. Maybe there is a fiduciary duty with your clients that if your data is vulnerable, that that might be a disincentive of alerting the world that there's vulnerabilities in the system. So maybe you just could explain to me what the disincentives are for information sharing or exposures or attempts of attacks for each of you, and then maybe we could talk about the incentives. Your National Transportation Safety Board, for someone who's not as familiar as you are, sounds like a wonderful idea. But maybe we could talk about this disincentives first and explain to me a little bit about that, and then we can figure out how to give incentives for people to do it.
Thank you, Congressman. I would break the disincentives up into two categories. One would be reputational risk, right? If I'm saying we've been targeted, somebody's penetrated through our network, they're inside We found them there. Here are the indicators that you can use to see if they're inside your network. That can introduce reputational risk. That could cause problems for stock. That could cause problems with regulators. The protections that were put in place, I think, address many of those concerns to the extent they can be addressed through legislation, but there are things that are outside the control of that legislation. The other factor I would say is the work factor. If I'm going as an organization going to share information with another organization, that's going to require me to do work. That's going for me to require that I take staff and give them the responsibility of sharing the information that other companies want. If I'm in a situation in which my network's been compromised, the last thing I'm thinking about is her network, right? And so I think that those are the two things that keep companies from sharing information.
Concur with Rob's remarks. I definitely agree that reputational risk associated with information sharing is paramount. It's in the front of your mind when you're doing this. A lot of times you're ensuring that the source of information is not to be attributed, and we leverage the traffic light protocol so that we can, as we're sharing information, we can tell the recipient, is this something that you can share publicly, or is this something you can share within your community, or is this something that is only between me and you as an individual? And that's been really helpful for addressing the reputational risk associated with that. Then you understand where that information is going to go on the other side. Again, that's through a trusted relationship. So you have to have a trusted community in which you can share that information that adheres to those stipulations associated with the TLP. And then definitely agree with the overhead to sharing. You have to have a robust program in place because as you share information, you're going to get questions back. And you want to make sure you have the resources to provide that potential context that might be needed for their individual environment. So there's definitely going to be you're going to have the maturity within your organization to be able to, the resources to be able to share that information in a way that it doesn't cause them more work on the other end and trying to figure out how to implement things, which can sometimes happen and cause, the lack of sharing.
I think there's two big reasons why people aren't sharing. I think the first is this kind of lack of expertise, especially in the small and mid-sized market, where they don't feel comfortable. Maybe they don't know if something is going to be relevant to everyone else. So there's insecurity, and you don't want to be the organization that's sharing irrelevant intelligence. And when you think about some of the larger organizations, they have full threat intelligence teams. They're producing intelligence. And so there's a lot more that they can share. For an organization that's a small or medium business, it might be as simple as they've seen this on their network. And that can be useful information to other organizations as well. If you're in the financial services vertical and a ton of small banks are seeing they're all seeing the same indicator, they don't need to share net new intelligence, but telling the other banks that they're seeing that is useful information. I also think that it's got to be really easy for people to share. We talk all the time about how often we don't have enough resources in cybersecurity, and analysts are overburdened. No one in cybersecurity says, "Man, I have way too much free time. I wish I had more things to do." And so when we think about sharing, it has to be something that is really easy for them. If you think, like for Amex, for example, they're part of FSISAC. They're already sharing with organizations. What do they need to do? Why should they share with the government? Why should they add this additional step in their processes? So I think when we're talking about how we can improve for AIS in particular and incentivize sharing, I think the first is to make it easy for people to do. They shouldn't have to stand up additional technology. They shouldn't have to go. It shouldn't be a separate workflow for them. It should be part of what they're doing already. And I think the other side is that what's unique about the government is that you have unprecedented visibility and unmatched visibility rather. And if I'm explaining to my executive why I'm sharing, they want to know what's the justification, what's the benefit that I get from this. And if they could say, well, I'm getting something that I can't get anywhere else, only the government has it, I think that's something that's powerful. That's something where there's an immediate reason of, oh, okay, well, you're giving me visibility that I have no other mechanism to get. Please keep sharing with them. I would like this to continue. But those, I think, are the primary ways we can improve it.
Congressman, I would echo the remarks around small and medium business. I think all of the issues that were raised there are in fact the case with our sector. What I would say is, in the case of the network service providers, especially from a critical infrastructure perspective, there's absolutely no disincentive to share. In fact, just the opposite. There's a tremendous incentive to share. And it's very common. First of all, we have formal venues where on a weekly basis, the network service providers convene and talk about what's going on the networks and what they're seeing. On a quarterly basis, the chief information security officers of the largest internet service providers meet to talk about what's happening in the environment globally and what they're doing to mitigate those risks. Importantly, when events arise, you immediately see the sector rallying to respond to those events. So, for example, in October of 2016, when the Dyn attack occurred, our members through the Comms ISAC immediately convened and were ready to respond in any way that was requested. We coordinated that activity through the National Coordinating Center. So the nature of the networks and their interdependencies and interconnection mitigates, I think, against any interest in not sharing information that impacts the network. And this has been going on for quite a while. It's quite sophisticated. It's often, private and behind the scenes. It does involve government when necessary. So I think that it's a very effective mechanism, and we learn from our experiences with each event, and it's gotten more refined.
Great, I thank you. All my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. I'd like to, before I start, take a moment of personal privilege to acknowledge the Texas National Guard and their leadership development class program. So if they would stand, and we appreciate your presence here today. I want to applaud them for all the work that they did during Hurricane Harvey. And you have at least 2 Texans in the room, I believe, the chairman. And so we are greatly appreciative. And as soon as I finish my questioning, I look forward to chatting with you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. And I'm sure I can safely say that all Texans thank you for your efforts in those regards. Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank you. It looks like clock has run, but I thank the chairman for his indulgence. Let me just read a statement that I thought was particularly potent, and I think all of us can reflect over. Over the past year, Russian actors targeted U.S. election infrastructure, and of course, that are not my words, but words from the intelligence community, and particularly the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Hackers escalated efforts to breach the domestic energy sector, and WannaCry and NotPetya ransomware wreaked havoc on public and private infrastructure around the world. And according to Symantec, the world of cyber espionage experienced a notable shift towards more overt activity designed to destabilize and disrupt targeted organizations and countries. Let me also acknowledge that the NPPD Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, specifically the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, carries out the bulk of our DHS responsibilities relating to facilitating the sharing of cyber threat information. It is a fixture that we have in place. And although DHS is authorized to deploy a range of tools, resources, and programs to carry out its cyber mission, it has limited authority to regulate privately owned networks and cannot require private entities to adopt specific security measures, grant access to their systems, or share information. And so I am applauding, and I do think it is important that we have this hearing. But I would like to emphasize with the level of breach that we experienced, that this requires as much a concern about the private sector as it requires patriotism, and the recognition that we must find a common path that gives comfort to the layered tech industry, but as well protects the American people. I don't think any of you sitting here, of whom I appreciate very much your presence, want to be part of a breached electoral system, one that is not reliable, one that does not equate to the democratic principles that we are so attuned to. So as I pose my questions, I'm hoping that we can find a pathway. I'm very interested in the thoughts offered that suggested that we must make it easy. We should not have to stand up new technology, which means we don't have to complicate it for you. And then, of course, what's in it for us. That's a little difficult for me on the what's in it for us, because I'm not sure I fully understand what would have to be in it for us. So why don't I go to the witness who indicated that, and let me make sure that I have. And that would be Ms. Kelly Ostro. What would it mean to say what is in it for us?
So when I say that, I mean in the context of you have to think about the return on investment for organizations. In cybersecurity, it's an incredibly resource-strapped organizations. CISOs are always asking for more money. No, there are very few organizations, I'm sure, that have spending decreasing. So when we think about information sharing, it's a cost like any other process or any other new tool or technique that we're going to bring online. And in order for that cost to make sense, we have to empower organizations with the answer for the ROI question. Is it that we're giving them visibility they don't have? Is it that we're helping them to protect organizations that are ultimately liabilities to them because they connect to their network? So in the example of banks, big banks have connectivity into maybe smaller banks' networks. It's beneficial to share information with those smaller banks because they expose the bigger bank's network to risk. So when I say the what's in it for me, I mean more in the context of ROI, and I completely agree with you. I think that patriotism should play a role in this as well. But I think if we really want to see success there, we have to help organizations answer the ROI question.
So would it be that the exposure, publicity, I guess that part of I mean, I don't think the government can give monetary value. So what would be the kind of exposure that they wouldn't get that would be positive that we could be engaged in for them doing information sharing?
I think that if the government has access to data, that is the thing that the government has, and I believe the number was 2,200 indicators so far that have been declassified and released to industry. I think that today there's something like 100 million indicators that's in our platform alone, and there's a tremendous amount of threat data that's available out there. I think that the 2,200 number becomes a little bit less of a large or an imposing number when you think about the context of available information. I think what government can do is by accelerating and maybe increasing the level of what they're declassifying, then they're answering the question for industry and saying, hey, I'm now giving you data that you can't get anywhere else. There's value here because you can't go to a vendor and buy it. You can't go develop it internally. And then that's an immediate, quick answer that when a CISO or a CEO says, why am I sharing with the government? They say because they're giving us visibility that we cannot achieve anywhere else, and ultimately that's going to benefit our protections.
Let me ask this question that if all of you would take a hit, and I have a third question, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be finished. In your view, what do companies perceive as the value of sharing information with DHS? And you've answered it partly, but I'd like to hear the other members, recognizing that there are issues with the timeliness and usefulness of some shared threat data, and what features of DHS bulletins, alerts, and other products do companies find helpful, as well as what do you think is, so the value, and then what do you think the biggest challenge is? And I'd like to start with the first witness, because I was interested in your comments about what would be helpful is determining, or we should be determining, how the cyber incident happened and what can we do to protect ourselves. I noticed that you said we can't require it, but I'm really looking for a way that we don't use the word require, but we have a cohesive relationship that it is beneficial, that I'm willing to act positively to do it, and it would help both business and government. So somewhere short of requiring, but obviously it has to be mutual benefit, as has been said earlier. But the challenges and the value of sharing information.
Yes, ma'am. I look at this, I look to the Department of Defense as a model on this. What the Defense Cybercrime Center has done with their DibNet program is they've created the mechanism by which companies can share, but they've also created a reason to share. And it's really because they take a customer service approach to their community. If you, as a DIB company, share information with DC3, they will share information that is pertinent back to you and to the rest of the community. You say, we saw this activity on our network, they'll push that through the intelligence community, and they'll come back to you and say, oh, that may be related to this, this, and this. They'll give you mitigation methods. They will do malware analysis, and they will push the findings from that analysis back to you. So I think if you want to get more information coming into DHS, you need to think not in terms of the volume of overall data that you get back by participating, but what do you get back specifically related to the information that you share in? That would be how you would create a higher volume of information coming into government.
So it'd have to be relevant to the particular producer of information sharing.
Yes, ma'am.
Would that be the gist of it? Ms. Baron DiCamillo?
Yes, I agree with Rob in the challenge. I think I would say it is really to help operators institutionalize this information within their environments. They need to be able to almost share playbook-type details, so that kinds of context that that's going to be specific to how I would implement these indicators within my environment, which is more than just an IP address or a URL. And so the playbook-type details that you need to implement this is just not available in a lot of the current information sharing systems. But the value is definitely inherent in all information sharing programs, and it comes down to one person's detection is another person's prevention. And so between these two, the value and the challenge, collectively, the ability to bring those two things together, and technology and these information sharing programs are coalescing on those two that we're seeing through the evolution of better capabilities, more available systems and such.
I don't know if you want to add any more, Ms.
Sure. So I want to agree with Ann on what she discussed with the context, because what tends to happen is that if organizations don't have that additional context, I think that's kind of the easiest step to what I talked about with that return on investment, even if it's not net new intelligence, but a course of action or a recommendation. I think that can be really helpful as well.
Mr. Mayor?
Congresswoman, thank you. I think you alluded to the fact that we're increasingly seeing nation-state attacks. That's just the reality of the environment right now. And in light of that, the government brings very unique capabilities, especially within the context of the intelligence community, to bring contextual light to what the campaign is, who are the targets, what's at risk. Recently, we've seen, and it's very encouraging, DHS invite more communications about providing context around some of these activities, advanced persistent threats as they're called. The challenge for us, and it's very frustrating as you can imagine, is that there are instances where classified information might be shared with people who are cleared, but the actionable part requires sharing that information with people inside your organizations who might not be cleared. And that frustration is real. And we have to work to resolve that. And one of the ways we can do that, and DHS has offered to do this, is we need to create tear lines, and we need to bring the technical people to the table so they can understand not necessarily attribution, but what does the campaign look like, what's the context, who are the targets, what are we seeing, and that's a two-way street. So just like we said, we can't legislate confidence, we can't legislate trust, but we can start building that trust, and I think we're beginning to see that evolve. The question is, can we ramp it up quickly enough in light of the accelerating attacks that we're experiencing?
Mr. Chairman, this was the third question. That was.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia has a 4 o'clock appointment, and I want to give him an opportunity to ask questions.
Well, can I just put my question on the record, and then I'll yield to this gentleman from, if I can.
You can.
It was to you, Mr. Mayor, because of, and I keep thinking I'm calling you mayor, so I'm trying to find out what city you're the mayor of, but the mayor of cyber threats. But can you think about this, and I will see whether or not I'm still here after the gentleman speaks. But you were concerned that we're learning a lot about are we learning enough to react to the evolving cyber threats? And then lastly, this whole issue of new devices. Are we learning enough about new devices? And my position is that we need a lot of work in that area. So thank you for allowing me to put the question on the record.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett's recognized.
So it's my pleasure, and I thank the gentlelady from Texas for some really good questions that I think dovetail relatively well with what we have in our 5 minutes. We talked about the actors being either nation states or non-nation states. I think that speaks to the nature of the threat, and it troubles me because historically the paradigm of existential threats to, and obviously a lot of you all are involved in the private sector, but I think that Mr. Kanaki nailed it when he talked about the tragedy of the commons. If there's not cross-communication, we're lost. And if we learn from the attacks on the grid in the Ukraine or sort of the probes in the Baltic states, we understand that what might be used against the public sector one day may be used against the private sector the next, and it really doesn't matter who the threat is, but it's different than what we faced in the past. So I wonder, and by the way, I want to get this on the record, Andy Greenberg's work, particularly in Wired, June 20th, 2017, in his book, How to Switch a Country Off, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, to the extent that there's stuff that's outside the realm of classified that can be enlightening to individuals in the room and perhaps abroad who are interested in learning about this, that's sort of sobering. Having said all of that, I'm an advocate for limited government. Having said that, if we don't information share, we're lost. If we look, I think, at what happened in Ukraine, almost everything that was used to flip the lights on and off at will on a timeline at the choosing of the attackers was off the shelf, but the whitelist, blacklist information wasn't shared, and so it wasn't caught. Can you speak to the nature of how important it is to communicate privately, publicly, and with one another? And I would love to get a 10 or 20-second bite on the nature of the threat. If you could give a 1 to 10 scale as it relates to the existential nature of the cyber threat. I think I know the answer. I want to hear from the experts, and I want it on the record because I think America needs to know the answer. We'll just work our way down the panel.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that the expectation we should have is that everything we've seen happening overseas will happen in the United States under the right geopolitical circumstances. If the lights have gotten turned off in Ukraine when Russia saw fit to turn the lights off in Ukraine, the lights will get turned off in the United States when Russia sees that it's in their interest to do that. So I think from that perspective, we need to be planning, and we need to be planning not just for how we protect the grid, but how we will respond and recover.
And you're not a preparedness guy, but the impact of the lights going off is dead people, right? I mean, literally, human lives are lost when electricity goes out, whether it's people on ventilators, whether it's people who need their medicines refrigerated, et cetera, right? Again, I know the answer, you know the answer, but this needs to be out there so that the American people understand the gravity of the answer. I mean, but that's fair to say, right? Human life would be the consequence.
Yeah, I think the important thing is to make our adversaries aware that we will view that as the consequence, and we will respond accordingly on a national level.
And we can move down the table. I don't want to, I got to find that amount of time.
So I would say it's important to remember that a lot of the advanced persistent threat actors moonlight as cyber criminals. So they are using the same tools in their day job that they're using in the evening against, for criminal or for monetary type initiatives. And so you have to look at them as the collective and look at the tactics, techniques, and procedures in a collective in order to be effective.
I'm not even going to try to butcher your name, ma'am.
It happens all the time. So you mentioned existential threat. I think those are scary words, and I think they're appropriate words. What's new, the threat is not new. We've always had conflict with other nations. There's always been pressure there. What's new is the reach that technology brings into our lives. The nation state I have a cell phone, I have a watch. When you get into medical technology and device technology, it's literally implanted in your body. Self-driving cars. As you see this evolve, the existential threat continues to grow because it just becomes a larger, more personal way that you can be touched and attacked.
And the scale, Mr. Mayor, we're going to get to you. And the scale required to launch a decisive or debilitating attack against a nation state, it used to be measured in cavalry or battleships or main battle tanks or fighter planes, and now it could be an actor with internet access, correct?
Correct. It was over the summer, I believe, or some point earlier this year. There was a botnet that used different devices, not traditional computers, servers, things like that. They infected devices that are in your homes, and because of the prevalence and think of the availability of those, they were able to create a pretty powerful botnet that could deny service. So, that's definitely something that
Mr. Chair, I'm about to run out of time. I want to give Mr. Mayor a chance, but what I want to do here today is draw on the expertise of these folks. Again, sort of recommend Andy Greenberg's work to the lay public, and certainly look forward to talking more about this moving forward, because another thing that's refreshing is the bipartisan nature, I think, of the fact that we are addressing this. Sure, people want to score political points. Yes, the Russians are bad actors. This is about America's existential future. And I think that the takeaway needs to be that the communication has to be public-private and it has to be free-flowing, because if the Ukrainians had good communication, a lot of these things perhaps are stopped because their systems are updated to recognize the malware that was used against them, at least theoretically. But if it doesn't get updated every month or every day even, off-the-shelf stuff brings the whole grid down. Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, and I'm done.
No, thank you, Congressman. And real quickly, there's no question. I mean, the exponential growth of IoT devices presents a serious risk to networks in terms of how distributed denial of service attacks can occur, and there's a lot of work being done to implement defense mechanisms. But I want to just refer to something on U.S. CERT. It's in the it's a top item on the alert. It's unclassified, and it speaks to a campaign against critical infrastructure involving electricity, water, transportation, and some others. All of the information, or a good part of the information, is in TLP traffic light protocol white. And there's a whole series of activities that can be done. That kind of information that's provided by the government is invaluable and needs to get dispersed widely, not just in terms of remediating the problem, but making people aware of how significant the threat is, which is what I think you're speaking to. Coming from the public to encourage greater government and industry collaboration in this area is very important. I think that it is bipartisan, and I think that every member of Congress can help move that forward.
No apology necessary. I thank all of the witnesses for your testimony today. I thank all of the members for their thoughtful questions. Members of the committee may have, in fact, are likely to have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will remain open for a period of 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Hey, thank you.